Hello there, peace be upon you, and welcome to Rational Religion, where we make sense of spirituality.
In today's episode of Believe You Me, we're going to be talking about evolution, what it means and why it's so contentious, and giving you a Muslim perspective on the issue.
So, evolution basically means, in its basic definition, is change over time. Now, when applied to biology in particular, it's become synonymous with the idea of Darwinian evolution or neo-Darwinian evolution. We're going to be teasing apart what those two things are in a moment.
Okay, so I think probably the first thing to talk about is what did people used to think? Throughout human history, really, people have looked at the world around us, especially the biological world, and have seen that organisms seem perfectly adapted and perfectly suited to their environments.
Yeah.
They've seen that they seem to have these beautiful features like a bird's feathers or a bird's wing, which allows it to fly, or, you know, the lungs of a person or the heart of a person or whatever it is. Pretty much anything you name seems exquisitely designed.
For its environment, it's a form and function.
Well, actually for its purpose more than anything.
Yeah,
right?
for its purpose, yeah.
It's just utterly, it's beautifully designed, and people have always used this as a sign of the existence of God.
Yeah.
Because they're saying, look, if I have a watch, for instance, it's a complicated thing, which my one's rubbish, so it's not that complicated, it's like 2 minutes behind. But if you have a watch which is well designed and it's got lots of different parts working together for a particular purpose, you'd say, well, this has to be the product of some kind of intelligent mind. In the same way, if we extrapolate that, then the whole universe, the whole rather biological world around us seems to have that complexity, but on a whole different level, and therefore it must be a product of an intelligence of a whole different level.
Yeah, if something looks designed, it has to have a designer. It's as simple as that.
It's very simple. You don't really need to explain too much.
So Darwin came along, and his idea particularly was very special and radical because it enabled people to explain the appearance of design within nature and within biological organisms without reference to a designer.
Right.
So how did he do that?
So Darwin said that there are a few processes going on. He said that you have random variation within species. So, for instance, my brother's slightly fairer than me, I'm slightly darker. But within all species, you have organisms that have slightly different traits. Some are stronger, some are weaker, some are faster, some are slower. And he said that actually, if you have this, certain traits will give you a reproductive advantage over others. So you'll be able to survive better in certain environments, and you'll be able to pass on your genes better. So, for instance, you have an antelope being chased by a cheetah, right? The antelope that's able to run faster, perhaps, is able to pass on its genes better than compared to slower antelopes, which are preyed on quicker when younger by the cheetahs. So that's sort of what he called natural selection.
Yeah.
You have nature and other environments selecting out weaker organisms or organisms which are less fit to survive.
Yeah.
Survival of the fittest, right? That's where the phrase comes from.
Yeah.
So you have these two processes, random variation, natural selection, and then a linking process of the fact that organisms' traits are inherited.
Yeah.
Right? They're inherited in time. And what he said, furthermore, was that there was one primordial organism. So it wasn't that everything was specially created, which is what people in the West at least thought before, that every organism was specially created by God and was almost zapped onto Earth.
Yeah.
He said that actually you have one primordial organism, one original organism, and over time it has enough random variation, and you have the tree of life. So you have the diversification of life with different net selective pressures applying at different points, along with the inheritance, and that eventually gives you the panoply of life that you see around us.
Yeah.
So what he actually explained was the appearance of design, or attempted to explain, was the appearance of design without an actual designer, by saying that it's just random variation, things are selected out, and that's why they look so good.
So that's why it's so contentious, really, because it, in a way, took God out of the picture with respect to that prime attribute of God, which is associated with God, which is creation. And so it has massive theological implications. Unlike, for example, the theory of electromagnetism, there's nobody who's going to be like really uppity about,
we could probably find some anti-electromagnetism people, but generally it's not clashing with theological convictions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's so controversial and has been throughout history. And now we have in the 20th century, in the 21st century, we have neo-Darwinism, and that neo that we put ahead of Darwinism now is the modern synthesis, which is the synthesis of Mendelian inheritance with Darwinian ideas, which is basically, in a nutshell, actually the things that cause the random variation between brothers and between siblings and between members of the same species is the genes.
Yeah.
Is their genes are different, and it's their genes that are passed on. Right. So now we don't just have reference, when Darwin was around, he didn't know about genes, so he would just refer to the fact that people had different traits. Now we'd say they have different genes. So that's all the neo-Darwinism.
He even thought that the environment could induce changes, which is one of the key differences between Darwinism and neo-Darwinism. So neo-Darwinism is quite a reductionist thing. It's literally kind of primordial organism, genetic changes, which are completely random, which are then selected, and then you have a diversification into into all the species that we see today who are coming from that. And it's an increasingly contentious view.
So that's a really great summary, actually, what you've just done, which is that there are two aspects to it. There's random mutation, or random change in the genes, and then there's natural selection, selecting for those genes that produce the organism with the greatest survival advantage with respect to that environmental pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, with respect to that, now a lot of atheists will advance that actually the big driver of evolution is natural selection.
Yeah.
I mean, Dawkins, for example, talks about how you can explain the appearance of design and that things are, he said in one of his books that biology is a study of things that appear to be created for a purpose, or appear to be designed for a purpose.
Yeah.
Right?
I.e., but they're not actually. His explanation is that natural selection has made them look like that.
Yeah.
So I'd say natural selection is almost like the workhorse of neo-Darwinian evolution and Darwinian evolution.
Yeah.
And that's what's used to try and explain away design.
And that's what Richard Dawkins, who's the most famous proponent of neo-Darwinism in the modern age, that you have Mount Improbable, and at the top of Mount Improbable you have a complex feature of an organism, like a wing, or an eye, or a heart, or a circulatory system, or whatever you want, which is complex. That sits at the top of the Mount Improbable. And to get there, he says, well, you don't go up a mountain in one step. You take many thousands of steps to get up a mountain.
Yeah.
And each one, although no one step is sufficient to take you right to the top, put together, they're sufficient to take you to the top.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good way of summarizing it. And he said that natural selection is what breaks down the improbability of the big thing into lots of smaller chunks. So he says, bacterium flagellum, like the motor unit. The motor unit, the tail essentially of bacteria.
Which enables them to move and find food and
it's
stuff.
an unbelievably complicated
It's got
thing.
30-something different proteins. It's it's phenomenally complicated.
So he says, let's put that at the top. And that's something which is of immense improbability. But what natural selection will be able to do is it's able to break down that immense improbability into a series of much smaller improbabilities. So you have maybe part of the system being created, then another part, and eventually you get to that complex thing.
Yeah.
And he said you can apply this to every biological feature out there. It's all just a gradual slope up to the more complex things.
Yeah.
And natural selection is able to account for that.
So let's take that head on.
Yeah.
Okay. So what would you say to that?
I would say that natural selection is not able to explain any biological feature in the world at all.
Oh, very, very bold. Okay. Yeah. All right. I thought we would go a bit gently into that.
It's a simple logical point.
You've really just gone for it.
Just a bit more nuclear, isn't there?
Yeah.
But it's a very simple point.
So how is that? Why is that?
Well, it's a very simple logical point. Natural selection is a selective process. It is not a creative process.
Okay.
Right? Natural selection is a culling process. It can only select what already exists.
Okay, so it's about the survival of the fittest. It's not, as they've said, it's not about the arrival of the fittest.
Exactly. So when you're trying to explain biological complexity, what you want is some kind of creative mechanism.
Yeah.
You want to say, when I'm saying, where does all this come from? I don't want the explanation that, well, its parents weren't killed at a slower rate than the others. That's why it's here.
Yeah.
That's not an explanation. I don't want to know about population genetics of its ancestors. I want to know, what is the creative process that actually got me to the eye? You know? What actually produced that? And what natural selection cannot do is it cannot account for any kind of creativity.
Yeah.
Because by its very intrinsic nature, it is not a creative process. So it is a culling process.
So it's like if you were, for example, an interviewer and the people come through the door for a particular job application.
Yeah.
And you say, well, yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah.
You've selected out of a preset possibilities.
But you haven't given birth to those two people, right?
No, you haven't.
You've just allowed them to stay in the building.
Yeah.
So you have to explain, where did they come from?
Yeah.
And that's what natural selection cannot do in any way. So any kind of explanation trying to show how we've got all the biological complexity around us, which invokes a selective process, a culling process, it's just
another word for death.
Yeah, it's a theory of death. It's a theory about how things die. It's a theory of death, and therefore it cannot be a theory of life. But what I want to know when I say, where did all this come from, is I want to know, what is the creative process that produced all this? Okay,
so what Dawkins would say in response to that is he would say, well, look, you're mixing two things up. You're mixing up the big jump to the top of the mountain with the small steps, which is that actually you don't get selection of the organism as of the organ system of the eye or the wing as a whole.
Yeah.
First of all, you get a bit of an eye, you get a light sensitive patch, and then that's selected for because it confers a selective advantage. And then you get some other thing, and then natural selection is able to add that onto that through these small steps. And then by the end of it, you've got a complex organ which is able to confer a massive survival advantage.
Mm-hmm.
But at each stage, at each of those little steps up that mountain, there's been a selective advantage.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say to that?
Well, you put it very well. I mean, he writes about this at length. He talks about how it says it's ridiculous to say you've got a wing that just comes out of nowhere, where, what if you had half a wing? And he says half a wing is better than no wing at all. And it's the same thing about an eye. Half an eye is better than no eye at all. So he's saying, you have waypoints on the way to the big thing. Which are beneficial in their own right. Of course, it's complete nonsense.
Yeah,
have you ever heard of half a wing?
Yeah.
What's half a wing? Half a wing, as far as I can figure out, is like a tumour on your back of like nervous tissue and like bones overgrowing it. There's no such thing as half a wing. It's either a wing, it either helps you to fly or helps you to do something, or it's not.
Yeah.
It's either some kind of apparatus, which is complex and well suited.
Has a function.
And then, for instance, let's take the idea of half an eye. Well, what is even a rudimentary eye, which is what he means by half an eye. He means a more rudimentary eye. A rudimentary eye is still a light-sensitive patch of some sort, which means you have a bunch of cone cells there, or whatever it is, whatever specialized, vision-producing cells. You have them, which are then transmitting their impulses in an organized fashion down some kind of optic nerve into some kind of centralized nervous system, which then allows the motor system, whatever it is, to respond to that, to the impulses that are coming in.
And the integration with other sensory inputs. And the integration
of that with other sensory inputs in order to confer some kind of survival advantage.
Knowledge, so that he knows, oh wait, there's a predator over there.
That is not a simple thing. That is not a simple thing. In itself, that is a peak.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a question of you have a lot of little things, there's only one thing at the end. Every single thing which he talks about, if it's real and existing, is itself a peak, which you have to get up to.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So actually what he's talking about is what he thinks is one big mountain for each trait is actually a mountain range.
Yeah.
Every single one of them, and you have to jump from mountain to mountain, if you will, in order to actually get to that final thing, if that's what you posit.
That's a great metaphor. You have these peaks of design along this mountain range with increasing complexity, and between the mountain peaks, you have massive chasms.
Yeah.
And if you were just to walk between them,
right,
you would have to defunction.
Yeah.
Right, before you could function up again. You literally have
you have to disassemble your apparatus and assemble a new thing. So I mean that's possibly the first thing I'd say to that whole analogy. I wouldn't call it climbing Mount Improbable. I'd call it falling off Mount Impossible, right? Because it's actually an impossible and ridiculous analogy that he gave.
Yeah.
But there's an even more fundamental problem about it. It's not just the gradient thing. Yeah. It's the fact that even then, at every point, even if we accept Dawkins's analogy, and we say, okay, fine, there's a gradient. Yeah. There's a gradient. There's a fantastic gradient. It's beautiful. Thank God. Oh, sorry. There's a gradient where you're able to go up bit by bit by bit. Every single step on that, in order to produce the next step, you still need a creative process.
Yeah.
You still need some kind of biological mechanism which is producing the next step.
Yeah, so each of those little steps which confers a survival advantage, you still need a sufficiently capable mechanism of explaining the origin of each of those single units of that step.
Right.
Within the realms of probability. I guess the second point with respect to natural selection is that it can't select for end function. Right. It doesn't have foresight. So people often talk about natural selection as if it's some chap who has, an all-knowing brain is just able to say, oh yes, this will be useful for this individual and this will not be useful.
So you're saying whatever's walking up that mountain slope, he's almost implying that it knows that it wants to get to the top and is therefore taking a path. Exactly.
Absolutely. Whereas actually, the person who's walking up that slope is actually completely blind to the direction and to the incline.
Yeah.
Completely has no idea where it wants to go. And let me give you a simple example with respect to this. So let's say you have two chimpanzees, okay? Pre-human chimpanzees. There's one's called Chad, the other one's called Einstein, okay? Yeah. Now, Einstein is slightly more intelligent in the moment as well, with respect to, picking fleas off the mate's back, noting which particular coconut is a bit more hollow than the other. He's a bit more clued up. And he's the one who has the potential in the future to ultimately, his genes, to actually be useful for the development of more intelligent species, ultimately leading on the way to humanity, right?
Okay, so he's got some kind of brain or genetic structure which would allow for more intellectual advancement
in the future
of his
progeny, or not even of himself, of his progeny, with many further developments and genetic mutations.
Yeah, but the potential's there.
So Chad, for example, who's his brother, he's thick as a chimpanzee. Okay? He doesn't have a clue what he's doing. He picks fleas off anyone's back, male, female, He eats every kind of coconut going, but you know what Chad's got, which Einstein doesn't? He's got brawn.
Yeah.
Okay? And Einstein is scared of Chad. Okay?
Yeah.
And basically, all the ladies, they go for Chad. Because, at the end of the day, Einstein's all nice in terms of dealing with their problems and the complex conversations they want to have with him, and he just keeps getting friend-zoned. And ultimately, they're just going for Chad because he's a strong one, and he's able to protect them when...
Yeah, and he's able
when
to,
the gorilla pack comes
and
along.
Einstein keeps having these falls. He's trying to, swing on the trees and the vines, and he falls down because he's over-intellectualizing everything.
I think we've overlaid this whole metaphor.
Chad is really going at it.
But the point is this, is that natural selection, who will it favour in that moment? Will it select for that individual who is potentially, his progeny is going to produce more complex and more intelligent offspring?
Yeah.
Or is it going to select for the person who's able to reproduce fittest in the moment? And the answer is, according to neo-Darwinists themselves, it would favour Chad. So the point I'm making really is that natural selection is simply an environmental pressure which does not necessarily lead to any greater complex function. If a volcano exploded next door to my house, and I'm a member of the species which stands at the highest point of biological evolution of 3 to 4 billion years, I would be... thanks, man. I would be completely wiped out. But the things that would survive would be pyrobacteria, which are the most primitive organisms in existence. And so the selective pressures do not necessarily lead to increasing complexity. They simply lead to
whatever's best in the moment.
Exactly. It doesn't select for complexity.
Yeah.
It selects for what that environmental pressure selects for.
And assuming you don't have some kind of designer shaping which environments happen in a sequence, you're not going to have... It's not going to be like, in a game where you save your progress and then you die and you go back to that.
Yeah.
You're not able to save. It's just whatever happens next. Even if you made loads of progress,
it's wiped out.
It'll kill you.
And given,
doesn't matter.
And given that there are more things that can kill you than there are things that are actually going to be of benefit to you, you're much more likely to be wiped out.
Yeah.
And
any progress evolution makes is much more likely to just go.
The founder, the fourth caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Mirza Tahir Ahmad, in his book Revelation and Rationality, he talks particularly about this problem of neo-Darwinism. And he gives a famous Indian story of a boy who went to school and it was raining so heavily, he got to school late. And the teacher says, "Why are you late?" And he goes, well, teacher, I walked to school and for every step I took forward, I took 2 steps back. And the teacher said, well, how is it possible then that you reached school in the first place? He said, well, I turned around and I started walking home. And that is neo-Darwinism in a nutshell with respect to natural selection, because it completely misses the point that natural selection is not selecting for complexity.
Yeah.
And yet
the trajectory of evolution is that we have ever-increasing complexity, we have more consciousness, we have this amazing, this amazing direction in evolution of getting to something which is fun, amazingly more intelligent, able to respond to the environment, more conscious, basically.
Yeah.
And natural selection, which just kills things in the moment, all this is like in the moment, and is not a coordinated response, is not going to be able to get you to that point.
Absolutely. And this is something that nobody's been able to explain to me, is that we ultimately, according to neo-Darwinism, we're all descended from bacteria.
Yeah.
And bacteria still exist. It's not like they were wiped out. They still exist. They're the most successful they're the most successful group of organisms in existence in terms of reproductive fitness. So the question is, how did everything else descend from bacteria according to natural selective pressures, which were only selected for reproductive fitness?
Right, because they're the most reproductive.
When they have been the most reproductively fit things since their existence.
We are terribly unfit.
We are completely unfit.
We have long childhoods. We have difficulty getting out the birth canal.
Yeah.
Because we have big, intelligent heads and brains. We have very slow reproduction times.
We have periods of very long dependency upon our parents. Anybody who's had a newborn baby will know that is a highly, maintenance intensive and resource intensive thing. And that doesn't last for 1 or 2 weeks like most animals.
Yeah.
Right? You take a horse and the horse stands up within a few moments. You take the human baby and the human child that stands at the apex of evolutionary history, and it takes, some many years for it to be able to be capable of even finding its own food. So, that's an example.
Reproductively is very unfit. And yet here we are.
Now, so the question we have to ask ourselves is, if the direction of evolution was driven by the impetus of reproductive fitness, why is it that the most reproductively fit organisms, bacteria, began at the beginning? And why did anything evolve from them, or rather devolve?
Nice way of putting it. That's very good. Now, there's something you said earlier about Chad and Einstein, and some people here will probably be thinking, well, in real life, what if Einstein, if he's got this brain which has the potential to produce more intelligence in the future, maybe, that's going to come out inevitably in his own lifetime. So maybe Einstein, in real life, you will have cases where Einstein is able to select the better vines. He's able to outsmart Chad and make him look like an idiot. And he's able to do all these other things which make him reproductively more fit in that time.
Yeah.
Right? And they'll say, well, actually, that's why Einstein is able to evolve. He is still selected, right? He's selected for those qualities. And those are the things which are going to help him to progress, or his lineage to progress. Yeah. But people miss the point. So if Einstein has some kind of reproductive advantage because of his intelligent qualities over his thicker brother, then those qualities are already existing. Mm. And therefore, you need to explain them by means of a creative mechanism.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you have something which only has the potential for progress, then that potential has not been realized yet, therefore will not give you a selective advantage. Therefore, natural selection cannot help.
Yeah.
If the selective advantage is already apparent, then you have to explain how that selective advantage got there by means of a creative mechanism. So in neither case is natural selection an explanation. If the survival advantage is already there, it has to be explained by means of a creative mechanism. And if it's not there, it's not going to be selected by natural selection. Right. So we come back to this fundamental point that you need the creative mechanism. Okay, so we hope you enjoyed today's episode. We've actually split this topic of evolution into a few different episodes. This one obviously was on natural selection, and if you want a summary of the arguments that we made today, what you can do is head over to rationalreligion.co.uk, which is our website. Got lots of interesting articles and different videos there. And if you go to the top, you can search for natural selection. When you do, one of the first hits will be Why Natural Selection Can't Explain Evolution, a new article of ours published in August, which basically summarizes most of what we've said today. Otherwise, make sure that you subscribe to our channel, click that notification bell, and it shouldn't be too long until we release the next episode on random mutation. All right, peace be upon you.